I just said I'm hoping that I don't contradict what Joseph just said. I think I agree with his paper. I'm going to take a slightly different tack. So first, I do want to just add my thanks to Joseph and Orietta for including me in the conference, and to all the people who helped to organize. I know how much work goes into doing this, so thank you for all that work. Okay, so what you have is a handout where some of the things on the handout will be on the slides, but I tried to minimize what was on the slides, and some of the things on the handout I'm not going to read. They're just extra. Okay, presented in 1963 to the Colloquium of Jewish Intellectuals, Levinas's Talmudic reading Toward the Other offers an analysis of repentance and forgiveness in response to the question of German guilt for the Shoah. And this is a question that he does not appear to answer definitively. He at one point says, there are many Germans who can be forgiven. Heidegger is not one of them. Actually, what he says is Heidegger is difficult to forgive. After a long discussion of the Mishnah passage, Tractate Yoma, and its corresponding commentary in the Gemara, Levinas turns to two rabbinic stories that appear to conflict with each other. In each story, Levinas presents the difficulty with how and when to approach the other, against whom I may have transgressed, for there to be forgiveness and reconciliation. In a third story from 2 Samuel, which is not part of the Talmudic passage, he examines more closely what I think can be linked to what he would later call expiation, by considering who was responsible for the wrong that was done to the Gibeonites. Published 13 years after Totality and Infinity, and considering the critical responses to that 1961 book, Otherwise Than Being raises questions about its relationship to the earlier writings. Is it an extension of Totality and Infinity, or is it a radically different project? Where Totality and Infinity is often described as focused on the other, Otherwise Than Being is viewed as focused on the subject, and an intense, even brutal description of subjectivity that is irrecusably responsible for the other, to the point of being responsible for the other's responsibility. This is expiation for the other. So my responsibility for the other's wrongdoing joins a list of terms like trauma, responsibility, vulnerability, maternity, proximity, and persecution, each one another name for this responsibility. Yet in Toward the Other and in Otherwise Than Being, the tension between this hyperbolic responsibility for the other and what I would say the necessary role of justice appears to be, is I think, inherent. In what follows, I suggest that a close examination of the dedications, although I'm going to spend less time on that, and the epigraphs to Otherwise Than Being can help us see this tension on which I believe Otherwise Than Being is built. So turning to the Talmudic reading, in the first story, there is a dispute between Rob and the butcher. The Talmudic passage does not indicate who is at fault, although the commentators indicate that the fault lies with the butcher and Rob was in the right. The butcher has not yet come to Rob to make amends, and Rob therefore felt it was his duty to bring forth this demand for forgiveness for the sake of the offender. And here we find ourselves in a reversal of obligation. The Gemara passage tells us that the butcher, upon seeing Rob, is so angered that when his hammer hits the animal bone, a fragment flies up, lodges in the butcher's throat, and kills him. If one commits a wrong against another, one is obligated to seek reconciliation. This is one way of approaching this particular story. However, in this story, Rob went one step further and approached the wrongdoer with the hope of creating a situation where reconciliation might occur. In so doing, the story seems to imply that this attempt by Rob angered the butcher so much that the butcher was killed. Is Rob responsible for this? The Talmudic passage seems to imply that he is. Even if I do what I know to be right and bad consequences follow, am I responsible for that? And the answer seems to be yes. So here's the first layer in the complex process of reconciliation. What does it mean to approach someone? When is it right to approach someone? I begin with this passage to open the discussion thus. Part of what Judaism indicates and what Levinas takes up is not only the complexity, but also the potential danger of correcting injustice, the way that efforts to bring about justice can breed further injustice, or at least further violence. In the second story, Rob is viewed as the original offending party. He was commenting on a text. Several rabbis walked in succession, and each time Rob started over. When Rob Hanina walked in, Rob asked how many times he must repeat himself, and this time he did not start over. Rob Hanina was deeply wounded by this. Although Rob attempts to appease Rob Hanina for 13 years in a row, the latter refuses to forgive. Even Rob, the just, cannot be forgiven, noting the difficulty in trying to set matters right once an offense has occurred. And then there's a dream that Levinas talks about. And in the dream, Rob would actually succeed Rob Hanina. So instead of forgiving him, he was forced to move away. But there are questions, and the Talmud asks these questions. Believing this to be petty, Levinas reminds us to look deeper. On the surface, what is at stake in this discussion is not only the wrong that Rob committed against Rob Hanina, but also that Rob recognizes his fault and that he asks Rob Hanina for forgiveness. The offended party can grant forgiveness only when the offender becomes conscious of the wrong. Referring to a dream that Rob Hanina had about the offense, Levinas tells us that the interpretation of the dream discloses precisely this point about Rob's unconscious motivations. The dream revealed Rob's secret ambitions beyond the inoffensive gesture at the origin of the incident. Rob, without knowing it, wished to take his master's place. Given this understanding of the wrong, Rob Hanina could not forgive Rob. How is one to forgive if the offender, unaware of his deeper thoughts, cannot ask for forgiveness? And so Levinas has this quote, "As soon as you have taken the path of offenses, you may have taken a path with no way out," unquote. So using this story, Levinas points us to something more complex in this process of making amends. He asks if the offender can measure the extent of his wrongdoing. Do we always know our motivations? And do we therefore truly have the capacity to even ask for forgiveness? What if the offending party is asking for forgiveness for the incorrect wrong? And if psychoanalysis has taught us anything, it is that we are often unaware of our deeper or ulterior motivations. That is, we are often opaque to ourselves. Foreshadowing a discussion that he will raise later in the text, Levinas also asks if an offense between intellectuals is the most irreparable. Although the commentary ostensibly focuses on Judaism's view of atonement and forgiveness, Levinas's reading could also be framed as a discussion about the complexity and potential horror of justice. He calls our attention to what he calls the savage greatness of the text, which he tells us is about the necessity of talion, or shedding blood to bring about what one wants or needs, even if blood is not necessarily what should be asked for. He then adds the greatness of the Hebrew Bible consists in remaining sensitive to spilled blood, in being incapable of refusing this injustice to whoever cries for vengeance, in feeling horror for the pardon granted by proxy when the right to forgive belongs only to the victim. His discussion in Toward the Other complicates an already complex Talmudic passage by including discussions of atonement and forgiveness from sources that are not included in the original Talmudic conversation. Here he turns to the story of Saul and the Gibeonites. And I'm just going to do this very briefly. In short, the Gibeonites have accused Saul of killing them when he executed the priests of the city of Nov, whom the Gibeonites had served. This act left the Gibeonites without a means of subsistence, and Levinas applies this point to German guilt. And this is his other quote: "The crime of extermination begins before the murders take place. That oppression and economic uprooting already indicate its beginnings, that the laws of Nuremberg already contain the seeds of the horrors of the extermination and the final solution," unquote. And this is embedded in the story of David, where there's a famine in the land, and David can't figure out why there's this famine. So he goes to all these sources trying to figure out what had happened. There are no political wrongs. There's no debauchery. There are all the usual reasons for why God would have, inflicted this famine on them. He can't figure it out. And then what David is told is to go seek out the Gibeonites. So then Levinas adds, the Midrash also affirms there is no fault which takes away the merit. There is simultaneously a complaint against Saul and the recalling of his rights. And these two parts become incredibly important in how justice finally is sort of resolved. Merits and faults do not enter into an anonymous bookkeeping, either to annul each other or to increase one another. They exist individually. That is, they are incommensurable, and each requires its own settlement. That's a quote from Levinas. But there is another theme I wish to examine here. In his gloss on this particular part of Levinas's commentary, Lawrence Edwards repeats Levinas's closing observation that in the end, quote, we are left with the image of this woman, this mother, this Rizpah bat Aya, who for 6 months watches over the corpses, quote. As the story goes, Rizpah, daughter of Aya and mother of 2 of the 7 whose death David ordered, took a sackcloth and spread it for herself over a rock from the beginning of the harvest until water fell down on the corpses from heaven. She did not allow the birds of the heavens to descend upon them during the day, nor the beasts of the field during the night. Quote, that's from 1 Samuel. Edwards and others compare Rizpah to Antigone. However, unlike Antigone, Rizpah is not a political animal, nor is it clear that she is defiant or disrupts the state. She, as the mourning mother, who does not speak, but who watches over the corpses, is the only person in the story worthy of moral praise. This is what many people claim when they comment on the story. If Bonnie Honig is right in her analysis of Antigone, then the way that various commentators like Cheryl Exum approaches Rizpah comes dangerously close to how modern day dissidents like to appropriate Antigone, and Antigone is appropriated repeatedly, even when not appropriate. We are all just mourning mothers. It is all we do. It is all we can do. But it is not clear that if we take this approach, that even the mourning of our dead children is anything more than an unavoidable naturalized response, which itself has no moral worth. Rizpah's actions become more interesting when we also consider the complexity of the actions of the other figures in the narrative. And so here I follow Gary Moll's view that Levinas's reading of the Gibeonites to demonstrate the deep connection between themes he addresses in his philosophical writings and those that have been segregated into the writings on Judaism. In particular, the story of the Gibeonites illustrates the role and the limits of what we would call expiation. Returning to where Levinas opens his discussion in 2 Samuel, we see David searching for these reasons to explain the 3-year famine, as I mentioned, over the land. So in his search for an answer, and he eliminates all of these possibilities, God replies, it is for Saul and the house of blood, for his having killed the Gibeonites. David summons the Gibeonites and asks what he can do to appease what has happened to them. How can he atone for Saul's sin? The Gibeonites seek talion, essentially vengeance. They ask that 7 sons of Saul be brought to them to be hanged or impaled. Feeling compelled to oblige, David agrees. He orders 7 of Saul's sons to be delivered to the Gibeonites, and they waste no time proceeding with meting out what they would consider justice. The ethical, philosophical, and theological questions this text raises are numerous, and none of them are lost on Levinas. He wonders, for example, how Saul's sons can be punished for the father's crime when there is an explicit prohibition against this in Deuteronomy. The complexity of who exactly to hold responsible for the massacre that accords the Gibeonites a, quote, right to justice encourages Moll to ask, yes, who exactly? Saul ordered the massacre of the city, but Doeg, the Edomite, was the officer in command. Later, David assumes moral responsibility, yet the Gibeonites focus all of their blame on Saul. Yet, as Moll indicates, even if the Gibeonites are right in who they blame, That is, even if it is the case that Saul and Saul alone is responsible, does this justify the execution of any of Saul's sons? But contrary to the commentators who often a Christian analysis, and this is Exum and also Sheldon, who I've included a quote, this particular problem is not lost on the Jewish commentators. Rav Sadia Gaon expresses a discomfort with the idea that the innocent would be punished for the guilty, and thus surmises that they must have participated in the massacre in order to justify this punishment. Leora Botnitsky turns to the figure of Cain, along with several other examples found throughout the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish commentary on it, to offer an argument about our responsibility for past wrongs. It is not that the child should suffer harm because a parent has committed sin. Rather, it is because some deeds are so bad or so horrific that their effects will reverberate through the generations to come. We will feel those ill effects just as we reap the benefits from the past and hope to pass those benefits to the generations who are not yet born. Contrary to Rizpah, being the only morally worthy character in the story, as some commentators claim, Levinas reads her role as part of a very complicated narrative about justice itself. David is unable not to respond to the call of those victims who cry out for justice, even if that justice is cruel. Yet to complicate matters yet again, Levinas refers to the Gemara passage that claims the Gibeonites were not part of the children of Israel, but part of the Amorians. The Talmud adds that David would have been the one to exclude them from the community of Israel. This is a quote from Levinas. To belong to Israel, one must be humble, place something or someone higher than oneself. One must know pity and be capable of disinterested acts. The Gibeonites excluded themselves from Israel, unquote. In other words, when the Gibeonites requested talion law to satisfy their need for justice, they, by action, excluded themselves from the community of Israel. The Gibeonites, this is Levinas, who lacked pity, put themselves outside of Israel, unquote. Thus, in one sentence, Levinas makes a proclamation not only about the Gibeonites, but also about the moral character of Israel as a whole. In his view, justice cannot be denied to the stranger who demands it, and yet the one who demands it is the one who lacks pity and thus cannot be included in that community. Levinas defines Israel precisely by this form of pity. And he goes on to talk about rahamin, which loosely is translated as mercy. And what's interesting here, especially given his focus on Rizpah, is that the Hebrew root for rahamin is rahem, which is uterus. And so the idea in Hebrew is that mercy is actually located in the womb. Okay, so then there we have Levinas redirecting our attention back to Rizpah. Okay, so the commentators who believe that Rizpah's actions are the only actions that are morally worthy neglect to understand this complex relationship that justice has to mercy. They also fail to understand that both are required by God and then both are needed to stop the famine. That said, Rizpah's act is not really an act of mercy. It is not for her to be merciful. That was for the Gibeonites to do. So this idea that when Rizpah covered the body, she was seen as merciful is not really an act of mercy. So moreover, the rains did not come immediately following Rizpah's actions. And this is where I think the story gets interesting, that people don't always read the story to its end. They came after David's actions. And I have this quote on your handout, which is kind of interesting. And his actions were actually learned by watching Rizpah. That is, the entire narrative is necessary, even if horrifying. The vengeance the Gibeonites sought and received, Rizpah's actions of generosity, which could only take place because of what the Gibeonites demanded, which then taught David what he needed to do. David's act of generosity, which mirrors Rizpah's, her actions complete the other side of the Gibeonites' need for talion, an act that Levinas declares more vengeance than justice, since the act seems to be more for themselves than for another. And in so doing, her actions, the extension of David's, reunite the houses of David and Saul. But all of this bloodshed was for a set of actions that Saul had originally set in motion. The story of the Gibeonites, inserted into a Talmudic discussion about forgiveness, responding to the theme of forgiving German guilt, exemplifies the complex relationship between justice and expiation, between justice and atoning for the other. My argument is that we see the same complexity unfold 10 years later in Otherwise Than Being, and we see this as a frame for the epigraphs to that book. So 50 years after the appearance of Levinas's, so 50 years after the appearance of Otherwise Than Being, many of the major tenets and thrust of his ethical thought, 50 years after Otherwise Than Being, many of the basic tenets and thrust of Levinas's ethical thought remain to be understood, developed, and contested. Much has been made of the two dedications to the book, and I'm actually going to skip over this part since Jeff did such a great job about this yesterday, and I'm just going to move on to, I'm actually interested in the epigraphs, which many people look at the one from Pascal, but most people don't focus on the ones from Ezekiel. So I'm gonna, here we go. Okay. I should also add, just like as an aside, that and Robert may also just know this too, that for so many years, well, and I say this as when I was in graduate school and we were doing Otherwise Than Being, many of my classmates actually didn't know that those two dedications said something different, because even when it's translated into English, the Hebrew is left in Hebrew. So the French is translated into English, but the Hebrew is not translated. And I would be happy to tell a very funny story about what it felt like when I was trying to explain to my classmates that the Hebrew was different. And for those of you that have seen the movie Annie Hall, and I can tell you that reference. Okay. Anyway, so moving on to Ezekiel. Okay. So starting with the passages. So the red is something that I just want to focus on. If we return to the original French, and the last part of the first passage changes a bit, Levinas's rendering of the Hebrew for the last line of the first Ezekiel passage reads as follows, and so just forgive my French, my very French accent, very bad. Mais de son sang, je te demanderai compte. So the French can be rendered in English as, but I will ask you to account for his blood. This will be important later, but what I wish to draw your attention to is this phrase, if you do not warn him. The second passage is a bit more straightforward, but one needs to look closely to see what most likely Levinas, what draws Levinas to it. In this passage, the Lord commanded that those who sighed and groaned at the horrible atrocities are to have a mark placed on them so that when the city is destroyed, they will be spared. That seems straightforward, even if harsh. In their plain reading, the passages from Ezekiel are in fact horrifying. They seem to suggest that an injustice took place in the city and God wiped out everyone in the city, including those who wept at the injustice, although these people were at first spared or were going to be spared. Not one person, even the seemingly righteous, was spared. If we approach the passage as I believe Levinas would, and attend to the layers of interpretation that characterize a Jewish reading, we find a different meaning of the passage, one that provides insight into the motivating sentiment behind what I believe is his writing of the book. Rashi, the 12th century French rabbi and foremost commentator on the Hebrew Bible, provides a gloss that suggests not everyone is as righteous as he or she appears. So here's the passage from which Levinas cites, but I included the rest of Rashi's commentary, and that's both on the slide and on your handout. From those standing before my sanctuary, a rabbi said, do not read this phrase as from my sanctuary, but from my sanctified ones. From those sanctified to me, they're the ones marked with the sign whom he had warned them not to hurt. Now he reneged and commanded the angels to destroy even them, because the divine standard of justice contended before him. Why are these different from those? Is it not that they did not protest, as is stated in Tractate Shabbat 55a? Rashi's gloss suggests that God reneged and everyone was destroyed, and it's because the divine standard or divine justice asked him these two questions. Why are these different from those? Is it not that they did not? Is it so that is it not so that they did not protest? In the Talmudic passage to which Rashi refers, divine justice not only stands outside of God, but also calls God out for drawing a distinction between those who did nothing and those who simply wept at what happened. At first glance, the perspective attributed to God is that those who wept are more righteous than those who did not. But the attribute of justice cries out that these groups are not different from each other. Neither group, including those who merely wept, did anything to protest the atrocities when they happened. Divine justice responds, it was in the hands of the righteous to protest the conduct of the wicked, and they did not protest. God replies to divine justice, it is revealed and known before me that even if they had protested the conduct of the wicked, they would not have accepted the reprimand from them. They would have continued in their wicked ways. Divine justice replies, if it was revealed before you that the reprimand would have been ineffective, is it revealed to them? The Holy One retracted his promise to protect the righteous and decided that those who failed to protest would also be punished. Decided that those who failed to protest would also be punished. In other words, weeping is not enough, even if our compassion differentiates us from those who cannot even muster a tear. Weeping because people are hungry or homeless is not the same as protesting the policies that contribute to their poverty, and groaning because there is injustice is not the same as protesting that injustice. Our protest simultaneously serves not only those who are victims of the action, but also signals our responsibility for the other's responsibility, those who would put these policies in place. We protest not only for the one who was hungry, but also against the one who created the conditions that caused the hunger. The Talmud writes it this way, sovereign of the universe, they had the power to protest, but did not. In other words, weeping at an atrocity, while it might indicate that you have compassion, is not the same as trying to stop the atrocity before or while it is happening. And as written in the first passage from Ezekiel, we have a responsibility to warn those who are about to commit a harm to others. In other words, both passages suggest our responsibility for the other's wrongs. Turning to the citations from Pascal, the first, that is my place in the sun, here is the beginning and the image of the usurpation of all the earth, speaks to Levinas's fundamental question, do I have a right to be? Using Levinas's words, what is most natural becomes most problematic. It is not my being in the world that takes, or my being in the world that takes, that world taking the place of someone. He made a similar claim more than 20 years before, and otherwise than being in a religion for adults, which was published from a talk he gave in Morocco in 1957. And here he says, rights do not ensue from the simple fact that a person needs a spas vital. And the consciousness of my I reveals no right to me. Although he is quick to say that he does not wish to teach that suicide follows from the love of the neighbor and the truly human life, he does not wish to say that a truly human life cannot remain a life satisfied in its equality to being, a life of quietude that is awakened by the other. Okay, so these are the quotes from the second quote from Pascal is a bit more curious. And I'm actually, just for time, I'm going to skip over that. But I find it interesting that here he's talking about what seem to be voluntary actions or, forced involuntary ones. And he makes a distinction where in Pascal seems to be talking about the need for spirituality when he talks about the hunger for the other. And for Levinas, I think it's actually not a spiritual need, that it's actually something that is truly a physical need, that we actually do need to respond to the other by actually feeding them. Okay, so going back to the 1963 Talmudic reading. So there, Levinas's discussion of the Gibeonites raises a question about how to address the guilt of the Germans' actions in the 30s and 40s. And the story provides an example of the tension with which I think Levinas struggles. I suggest that the epigraphs he uses to frame how we might read Otherwise Than Being as a text that is struggling with this hyperbolic responsibility and with the need for justice that responds to a failure in that responsibility. They illustrate not only the responsibility for the other's responsibility, which includes our responsibility to warn and to protest, but also the role of justice, the consequences when we fail in that responsibility. In other words, Levinas makes a condition of our subjectivity our responsibility for the other's responsibility. And by this, it's what they might do that's wrong. It is a subjectivity that is pre-ontological, and yet this responsibility carries the necessity of justice. He talks about this in Otherwise Than Being, that the citations, I mean, it's also in Without Identity, in what I would consider these bridge essays between totality and infinity and Otherwise Than Being, where he's also struggling with a lot of these themes, but he links things like philosophy and sort of the limit of this extreme responsibility to the way in which justice needs to interact with us. If we do not warn the other of the harm they might commit, and if we do not protest the harms they are committing, there are consequences we must face. And I think that comes out in Toward the Other and in these epigraphs. So that's it. Thank you.